What's going on, YouTube? Culturedog Sam Hatch back here with another Blu-ray review, a spotlight review that I've been awaiting, and some of you had mentioned that you were looking forward to seeing too, so it brings me much pleasure to finally be able to say I've delved through the extras and the film itself in the new collector's edition, Scream Factory's release of The Return of the Living Dead. This has been a big summer of anniversaries and throwbacks, thinking back to 1986 recently. Just celebrated the anniversary of Big Trouble in Little China, and talking about T2's anniversary, so it's easy for me to flash back, even though it's not coming up on a major milestone. It'll be the 31st anniversary, but it's easy for me to flash back to 1985 in August, and I was extremely excited to see the upcoming film Return of the Living Dead. I had been huge fan of Dawn of the Dead at that point, and had enjoyed Night of the Living Dead to an extent, but that movie really didn't come into its own until a little bit later, like when the Millennium Edition, DVD and the Elite Laserdisc came out. That's when it kind of was given a great presentation. It was kind of dwelling in a public domain video ghetto at that time, and there were so many dodgy, like Good Times VHS video releases and stuff, and horrible colorized versions, etc. So Dawn of the Dead really connected more with me at that point, and just a huge fan of late 70s, early 80s horror. And I didn't really know that much about Return of the Living Dead going into it, other than it was kind of vaguely connected with the George A. Romero series. Dan O'Bannon was directing it. I was a fan at that point of his work. I know my dad was a huge Dark Star fan, and I had, of course, loved Alien, and he'd done a lot of work with Tobe Hooper, etc. And Tobe Hooper was originally slated to direct this film, but I thought it was cool that, Dan O'Bannon was directing this zombie flick. And I was wicked into both the East Coast and West Coast hardcore punk scenes at the time, and I was a huge fan of Alex Cox's Repo Man, and just the vibe of it, the soundtrack of it, and the way this film was marketed really felt like a horror movie version of Repo Man, with that same kind of punk energy, and cashing in on the look and the sound of it all. And I had been exposed to that early trailer with 45 Graves, Do You Want to Party, blasting out over the image of the skeleton popping out of the ground and his eyes popping open. I was just running around the house singing that all the time, and was completely amped up to go see this movie. So my birthday was on the horizon, and this may come as a surprise, but I was a bit of a film fan as a youngster, and my parents, of course, keyed in on that and decided that, for my birthday every year, they would let me pick a movie that I would go see. And usually it was with a big group of friends. So I'd be like, I want to go see Disorderlies with the Fat Boys and stuff like that. But for 85, it was just going to be a night out on the town with me and my parents. And I was like, no brainer, so to speak. Return of the Living Dead. We are going to see it. And went to go see it in the old Showcase cinemas. And one thing that was interesting is this movie came out around the same time as George A. Romero's Day of the Dead. And there was a lot of confusion about that, because how they were tied together, but yet disparate entities. And Day of the Dead came out earlier, and I swear it had opened wide by the time Return of the Living Dead had been released. But when I did go see it in the theaters, it did have the trailer for Day of the Dead with all the zombie arms coming through the concrete walls, and that alone terrified me. And maybe it just hadn't opened in my region or locally yet. And then Return of the Living Dead unveiled itself upon me. It was what I was expecting and more. If you haven't seen the film, which you probably have if you're watching this anyways, it is the tale of a man named Freddy, a youngster, who's on his first job at the Unita Medical Supply Company, and it takes place in Louisville, Kentucky, even though it feels and looks much like Los Angeles, but more on that later. And it just drops you like in medias res, like you're working with this guy, and it has a very documentarian feel about it. And of course, the first thing you're alerted to when you're watching the film is that it's all based on truth, and it's all completely accurate, and that's the sort of stuff that was like bizarre. This movie had an edge to it, because while it is funny, it's a comedic horror film. It has this really unnerving edge underneath it all. So it kind of lays those seeds. It drops things like, this is all true, and then it kind of layers on a ton of extremely over-the-top visuals and performances, etc. on top of that. But there's always that aquifer of terror underneath everything, just kind of simmering and moving around. So you have that already to kind of put you ill at ease. And then, yeah, you're just hanging out in this in this medical warehouse as they're essentially shutting down. And James Karen is the guy who is Freddy's new boss and is going to show him the ropes. And then Clu Gulager is an amazing character named Bert in this, who's the manager of the location. And he's going out for the weekend, shutting down and leaving these two suckers back to close up shop, etc. James Karen already was a bit of a household name in my house in particular because of his performance in Poltergeist. You know, Teague was, you know, we knew that guy. He was like part of the family, so he was an immediately recognizable character. And you know, bouncing back and forth between that is the tale of Freddy's friends, this kind of bizarre gaggle of strange characters that you wouldn't think necessarily would hang out together, because there's, you know, really intense punk rockers, there's Suicide and Trash and Scuzz, but then there's, you know, Chuck, who's like a little dorkier, and of course you got Tina, who's way more of a mall girl than any of these people. And that was kind of one of the things that was interesting about the film. Like, when people see it for the first time, they're usually like, oh, come on, like, why are these people with those people? That's not even remotely believable. But then I was thinking back in my high school days, and I mixed in with different sorts of crowds. You know, there was nights when I was hanging out with the guys that were, you know, more into building up their Camaros and etc. and the metalheads, and then some nights it was with the more preppy people. So it kind of was realistic in a fashion that there sometimes are groups that are comprised of different subgroups. And the fact that it's supposed to take place in Louisville, probably be a lot harder to find a bunch of people with the same kind of punk or death rock attitude than it would be in Los Angeles. So it makes sense that you just find friends where you can find them, and it doesn't matter if they all have safety pins through their nose, etc. But it's just a cool group. They're just always looking to party, and etc. Linnea Quigley is great in there, and they're going to see Freddy and hang out with him and go party. So that's great. That's like the thrust of the story. Everybody's going to party and hang out, and sure enough, right across the street from You Need a Medical Supply is the Resurrection Cemetery. So while they're waiting for Freddy to get off of work, yeah, well, let's go hang out at the cemetery. And the way they tie this in with Night of the Living Dead, and if you see the documentary on this disc, the More Brains documentary, which had been released before, and I was remiss in not picking that up for myself because it's an amazing documentary. More on that later, of course. But if you see that, it spills the whole history behind the making of this, in which John Russo, who was part of the creative team on the original Night of the Living Dead, he and George A. Romero amicably split the intellectual property, essentially. So George A. Romero would continue making his Dead sequels, and then John Russo had the rights to the Living Dead sequel series. And immediately after Night of the Living Dead, you know, there was a push to make a sequel, and John Russo had worked on that for many, many, many years, and never happened until long after Dawn of the Dead came out, and Day of the Dead was already hitting theaters. And by that time, it had morphed. The story had changed a lot. You know, Tobe Hooper had come on as the director, and then, you know, later that was not to be. And so when Dan O'Bannon came on and rewrote it and worked on it, he completely twisted the tale. So the solution that was come up with was that Night of the Living Dead was a true story, and that the facts were twisted enough to present it as a fictional narrative. And James Karen, his character, knows that the remains of the original zombie outbreak are actually in the basement of the Needed Medical Supply. This film has these great character pieces with Tom Matthews and James Karen as he's telling this ghost story, essentially, of this body that's in the basement, and also throwing in all these jabs at the U.S. military and talking about how ineffectual they are, etc. And in the basement, yes, indeed, is this canister containing Tarman, played by the great Alan Troutman. And some doofus behavior later, the canister is breached, and again, pointing the finger at the Army for having severely lacking storage containment techniques. And this gas, this 2,4,5-trioxin that's been contained inside this thing for so long, escapes, gets into the atmosphere, and wreaks havoc on the local populace and undead populace. The cool thing this thing does, though, is it keeps like one foot in a sort of reality. And I love the fact that it played into 80s nuclear fears. It quickly sets up this establishing background story of the lone government agent who's perpetually searching for these missing canisters, and like knows that his job is never over until they can find them. And the movie didn't have to do that. It didn't have to establish that, but it does a great job, and it has some amazing payoffs later. So it's that kind of dose of reality mixed in here. Like when some of the first zombies are brought back to life, you see the shoes of the person in the casket, and it's just got that little dose of realism that adds a little extra kick to it. The performances are amazing. It is a comedic film in that all sorts of outrageous events happen to these characters, and James Karen in particular, actually Tom Matthews as well, play it to the hilt. They really push it. Dan O'Bannon obviously pushed them to the edge, and that also makes it hysterical. Their hysteria makes it hysterical and terrifying at the same time. There's that great there's these two flows that are just bouncing around in this film, and it's like tectonic plates pushing against each other. There's moments where you're like, ha, gut busting, because that is so silly, so hilarious. There's a corpse with a missing head running around. There's split dogs animated and stuff like that. But the hysterical reactions to this stuff just puts this underlying sense of fear in your gut. Like that you would almost react in the exact same fashion to this. That there's no solution to a lot of the problems that are posed to our characters, our protagonists in this film. There's just undying terror, and there's no way to get out of it. And I love how they played that against the punks. These nihilists, these guys, with why bother painted on the side of the car, yet are completely put out when the roof rains on them. And so it's great. So it kind of pokes fun at that, youthful aggression mixed with like whininess and coddled behavior. But of course that reality was tied in pretty well with the kind of Cold War and the threat of a nuclear future. Then you add in this apocalyptic zombie element. It was a really, really cool and potent stew. And Don Calfa is eventually introduced as the man who works the mortuary, is embalming everybody in sight, and there's this subtext that he is in fact an escaped Nazi who is just kind of laying low in Louisville. And of course that stuff went right over my head when I was a kid. I was just tapped into the fact that, yeah man, there's the Cramps on the soundtrack, etc. And this is cool. And he brings so much to the table as well. And it's with his character Ernie's help that the situation gets worse when some of the body parts are burned and then in turn create a form of acid rain that lands on the Resurrection Cemetery and brings the dead back to life. So much insane stylish stuff going on in this film, from Linnea Quigley's flare-lit striptease. I just love Suicide as a character, this guy that's tougher than tough, and chains connected to his nose, and yet nobody gets him, that sort of thing. Love that stuff. There's a great dynamic, good kind of ensemble piece, and I like how everybody intersects eventually over at the mausoleum. And it's got such a different vibe than the Romero films. Those were also bleak and occasionally depressing, but this one was so interesting how it mixed in the music and the laughs and still kept the terror in there as well. Really good special effects, and the conversation with the corpse, this elderly woman who they talked to for a bit. I mean, that was groundbreaking stuff. This movie is the movie that introduced the concept of zombies eating brains. It also was an early showcase of fast zombies. I know that a lot of credit for that goes to 28 Days Later, which isn't technically a zombie movie, and Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. But this was, many, many, many years earlier doing the same thing. These guys were fast, and they could talk. It didn't matter if they had lips or not, so, you have to have a little bit of a suspension of disbelief there, but they would have a conversation with you. And that was the genius bit of writing from Dan O'Bannon to have a sit down. And of course, you have this guy who's possibly an ex-Nazi agent having to sit down with this dead woman. I'm like, so why are you doing what you're doing? Genius stuff. And then mixing in the nuclear fear and making that writ large was another stroke of genius. And just the whole inevitability of everything on the nuclear front, on a zombie front, etc. It's just an amazing stew. And there's really nothing like Return of the Living Dead, and there hasn't been really since, and there probably never will be. So it's a film that I always held near and dear to my heart and would watch on a regular basis. Some great lines. It's super quotable. The music is fantastic. And I bought the soundtrack, obviously, right after this. You know, it's got The Damned, it's got The Cramps, it's got, Stacy Q. I had no idea she was part of SSQ, but more on that later. But the 45 Grave song, Party Time, was really, really cool. So it's an iconic movie just all around, from the poster art to the soundtrack, to the events of the film, the makeup effects, the Tarman creature. Yeah, you can't touch Return of the Living Dead. It's just epic. So yeah, I saw this opening weekend and huge fan, so I immediately, of course, taped it off of cable and then picked up the VHS, which sadly I think I might have gotten rid of. At the time, I didn't know that there was an actual market for horror movies on VHS, or just VHS movies in general, and I ditched like an exploitation gold mine over at Goodwill years ago. So Goodwill shoppers, you are welcome. And I think I might have ditched that because I did eventually, quote-unquote, upgrade to the MGM DVD, and a couple special features were on this, including a Dan O'Bannon commentary with production designer William Stout, and the Designing the Dead featurette, and some conceptual art and TV spots in the trailer, etc. And then there was a later collector's edition that I actually didn't buy immediately, and then it was released on Blu-ray as well. And I slacked on picking that up too, until last year when they came out with this this variant of, it's the exact same disc on the inside, but this kind of cover art variant. I figured that was pretty cool. Now this had even more stuff than the previous one, more commentary tracks. There was one with the cast and crew, a Decade of Darkness featurette, and some other goofy things like zombie subtitles for the film. And still people clamored over the VHS copies and the Laserdisc release, because these later 5-inch disc releases were controversial for having a different mix. Apparently Dan O'Bannon wanted to tinker and get a little bit revisionist with the sound design. He wasn't really a fan of the way some of the zombies talked and the way Tarman in particular spoke, and he went through and redesigned their voices, and there were rights issues with the music, which was really too bad. So in particular, Deadbeat Dance by the Damned had to go, and that was a pretty semi-iconic scene early on where everyone's driving around in Suicide's car and you hear it blaring over the boombox that the character Chuck is ostensibly playing. But that stuff caused the fans to be a little bit bummed that the original mix wasn't available. And then pretty much shortly after I bought that version, Scream Factory announced the impending collector's edition of Return of the Living Dead. And there is a version with a poster and I think an alternate slipcase that everybody already has by now, because if you pre-ordered it, you got it a few weeks early. But it's got a pretty cool illustration by Graham Humphreys on the cover. It's got most of the main amazing bits there, Tarman and the woman corpse and Linnea Quigley looking a little stumpy there. But yeah, two of the things they had going for them with this is that there was a new 2K scan of the interpositive, and they were able to release the original mono soundtrack, though still without getting the rights for Deadbeat Dance by the Damned. I love that song because I even made a mix CD for Halloween years ago. Yeah, this is it, and one of 5. And 2 of the tunes on here I just got right from the vinyl, Deadbeat Dance and Surfin' Dead by the Cramps. So I know that song intimately. I love it, but they actually used Straw Dogs' Young Fast Iranians over the scene in the other alternate version, and that actually works rather well. It's got a kind of Misfits-esque vibe to it. Seems to work really well on a punk vibe and seems to match the style of something Suicide per se would listen to. So it doesn't really hurt the film, though it is interesting how the tail kind of scream from that song and the reverby surfabilly cackle from the beginning are in different cuts that actually remove the song, so they still have these little aspects of the song in there, even though they didn't get the rights for it. So that's a shame, but on the other hand, it's cool having the rest of the stuff with the original Tarman voice, etc. Again, I can't get outraged over that either. I mean, I've seen the original version many, many times, and it's nothing that takes me out of the film. As much as I've seen it originally, like, I have to actively think about it. Hey, Tarman sounds different, or that guy asking for more cops, it sounds a little bit different. It's not that like, brains! That would stick out. So I hate to say it, but I think people are like a little bit overly mega complainy pantsed about that moment, because I would never watch the version with the deeper voice Tarman and then finish the movie going, wow, that movie sucked. That zombie should have had a way higher pitched voice. And it would have been so 1985-y and would have saved the picture. Yep. No, you probably would never notice. So a lot of these revisionist decisions by Dan O'Bannon, they didn't destroy the film. The shame is that you didn't have access to the original. But yeah, now you can listen to any version you want, pretty much. There's been a few overseas releases recently that I know a lot of people have been importing and have been generally pleased with. So the question was, how is this new 2K interpositive scan going to look? And looks really good. I did a direct comparison with my Blu-ray from the original MGM version, and yeah, a lot nicer. There's good grain. The original, it was a little bit more washed out. There wasn't as much amazing contrast. The contrast in this is great. The colors pop. When you see Freddy's shirt early in the Unita scenes, the red of the logo just really explodes off the screen. And yeah, very, very rich looking. There's a healthy grain structure, and yeah, it was just natural looking the whole time watching the film. Nothing stood out at me as like I'm watching home video, I'm watching digital, etc. Just very, very natural looking. It's 80s, so there are a couple bits that have a little bit of a dated look to them. But then again, 80s films in general were pretty rough looking, but this looks way better than, say, of recent reviews, the Garbage Pail Kids movie or something like that, thankfully. It looks really, really good. And there was better definition to like the on-screen titles. They were a little bit more like blown out and blobby edged on the earlier versions. Great color, great contrast, good definition. I mean, you can actually read the sign about, Bert being a slave driver and is also going bald too. It's an eye chart like that somebody wrote up in the Unita office. You could, just stand up and walk up to your screen and read all that stuff. So the details of the film really come to life, and yeah, really impressed with the look of it. For such a cheap film, there's a lot of cool visual stuff to it. The matte painting, and I believe Ken Marshall of like Titanic paintings fame did the Denver matte painting where the army is beaming signals around the country. Yeah, that thing is gorgeous looking. Some of the effect shots, the model shots are actually pretty cool when they do bust those out. It's a pretty nice looking film for a low budget, cheap, 1985 zombie flick. So, as I mentioned multiple times before, there's a lot of audio options on here. The 5.1 version that had been ported over from the earlier releases and a 2.0 version, all DTS-HD master audio. And the thing you've been waiting for is the original audio in mono, also DTS-HD master audio. It actually sounds really good. The mono it's still spacious. It's got a good vibe to it. It's airy, and it's not like when you think about some older films with shrill mono soundtracks. There are a couple times when it's at a certain level and it needs to, pump it up a little bit and add some other Foley effects or some zombies crashing through walls. And some of that's a little exaggerated and is a little too loud, but overall it's pretty well balanced. The dialogue is still intelligible, and there's really no need to jump over to the 5.1 version. The 5.1 does sound good, and it does have those revisionist changes to it, but it doesn't bring that much to the table that is above and beyond what's already delivered in the mono track. I'm completely cool with sticking with the mono on this. Yeah, again, the only caveat there is that it does not have the Deadbeat Dance track over the early scene with Suicide and crew driving around in the car. But that said, the replacement track does work, and it could be a lot worse. So, yeah, you got a few options there, but I definitely recommend just sticking with the mono. Special features. Well, the first special feature is they actually corrected the copy that has been plaguing these things since back when I got this 2002 DVD. That mentions that Freddy is working his first day at an Army surplus store, which did carry over to the MGM Blu-ray, still Army surplus store, and in the original ads for this release, it was Army surplus store. But yeah, kudos to Scream Factory. They actually got it fixed before printing, and it says first day at a medical supply warehouse. So kudos. Tons of extras on this thing, and including a lot of stuff that was ported over from previous versions. So some people may complain about a lack of new extras, but for me, it's an amazing release, partly because I didn't already have more brains. But it's on 2 discs. So the first disc has 2 new audio commentary tracks. One with Gary Smart, who is co-author of The Complete History of the Return of the Living Dead, and Chris Griffiths. And that one was good because it's kind of more from a fan perspective. I do enjoy good fan back and forth. And I was a little bit get off my lawn in the beginning because they were talking very excitedly about how they had not seen this film until the 90s, and they seemed to be very uncertain about some of the history behind Dan O'Bannon's career. And I'm like, come on, that's Bush League. But then on the other hand, if you contrast that with some of the more scholarly tracks on other releases, like the stuff from Stephen Haberman, where that stuff is very dry and super wicked informative, but comes off sounding like a guy reading a Wikipedia entry. So this is actually a cool commentary track because of the energy of the 2 guys and just the conversational tone of it. So that was worth listening to. And also a commentary with Tom Matthews and John Philbin. So Freddie and Chuck. And makeup effects artist Tony Gardner. And the one thing they don't mention on the packaging is it's actually moderated by Sean Clark. But it's pretty funny. John Philbin's a character, and he's got no problem speaking his mind. It's pretty fun. Sean Clark actually comes up with some good stuff, too. Especially when they're talking about the ladies of the film. So, yeah, it gets a little rowdy at times. Then there's the carryover commentary tracks, the one with Dan O'Bannon and William Stout, and an older commentary track with the cast and crew, which is also pretty fun and very energetic. And then there's The Decade of Darkness, a featurette on 80s horror films that has been ported over from the early collector's edition. And it is cool because there's a lot of stuff with John Landis and Joe Dante and Elvira, etc. But it is what it is. It's a featurette about 80s horror, but it's only about properties owned by MGM Home Video. So they're talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, they're talking about this and that, Child's Play, etc. And as you're watching it, you're like, oh, yeah. This is about 80s horror as long as it fits certain parameters of what studio released them. So it's not very comprehensive. It is cool seeing all that stuff, but it is essentially an ad for MGM horror films. So, take that for what it is. Then there's some theatrical trailers, TV spots, still galleries, and the couple of zombie subtitles. There was the zombie subtitles, which is gimmicky and kind of goofy because this is a film where the zombies speak. So a lot of times it's just like arg, arg. It's trying to play into the notion that zombies just make noises. So whenever there's a crowd scene, there is obviously just a general crowd noise, as there would be if you were alive or undead. So they have a lot of kind of subtitles on the screen. So it's cute and everything like that, but I didn't see any subtitles for when they were actually having conversations with the zombies. So, yeah, so I don't know. It's kind of gimmicky. But then there's also the, in their own words, the zombie speak track, which from what I could tell was the same zombie subtitle track, but augmented with the zombie's thought process. So when one slips and falls down, he laments that in the subtitle. So again, it's all pretty goofy and gimmicky. So check it out if you want, but it's not really anything make or break. But also for the special features on both discs too, get ready to ride your volume, because it begins with a loud pop of the canister, the Tarman canister popping the lid, and if your volume isn't set to the right level, you might blow a tweeter or something like that, or freak out your neighbors. So beware of that. Disc 2 has new featurette, the effects of The Living Dead, which is obviously very interesting. And also Party Time, the music of the Return of the Living Dead, which was something I was wicked into. Again, I mentioned before, I was way into hardcore punk and everything like that, and the whole, SST records things. So it was cool getting a little bit of a backstory about a lot of the stuff on here, because these were new breaking artists at the time, so it wasn't all, Black Flag or the Circle Jerks or anything like that. It was, 45 Grave, who I wasn't really that knowledgeable about at the time, and the Cramps, obviously, I knew, and the Damned I knew. But some of the other acts I didn't know that much about. TSOL I had seen a lot about, but hadn't heard at the time. So this film introduced me to a lot of artists. But I had no idea still to this day that, Two of Hearts' Stacy Q, singer, was from the band SSQ. And how the SSQ song is such a standout moment in this film. So, again, I mentioned before, it was a bummer the Damned song was taken out of the film. But the songs that are really, the Rocky Erickson song, the Cramps song, the SSQ song, and the 45 Grave song are the 4 that you can't take out of the film. That would actually mar the film, I believe. So anything else, I can live with possibly. But it was really cool. Interviews with a lot of the musicians. You get a little bit of an acoustic performance of the TSOL song, and a little bit of discussion about the legacy of the soundtrack and how it's still kind of going strong. There is a new Horror's Hallowed Grounds segment revisiting the locations of the film with Sean Clark, and it's a mixed bag. It's pretty cool. They're always a really cool event. And it is interesting again that this film, supposedly taking place in Louisville, Kentucky, is very Los Angelino. So it's a mixed bag in the fact that a lot of these areas have been redeveloped. So these kind of sprawling punk urban nightmare landscapes are just all relatively nice, nondescript roads now, and offices, etc. nearby. So it's usually Sean walking down somewhere going, yep, this is where that used to be, and this is where the cemetery used to be. And so some of the off-site stuff is in there. The house with the army man who's looking for the canisters, that's still in the same condition. The Unita Medical Supply office, that building is still in a similar-ish condition. But for the most part, there's really nothing out there on the streets now that really resembles the streets of 1985. Sadly. But it's still a pretty cool featurette. It's just a little bit shorter because there's really not that much to find. It was cool, too, in the commentary track, because John Philbin was saying about how he actually surfed right behind that house. And then Sean Clark was like, I was just there. And he's like, really? Yeah, because shooting this on location thing. And there's a conversation with Dan O'Bannon, his supposedly final interview. So that's pretty interesting. There's an interview with John A. Russo called The Origins of the Living Dead. Again, awesome stuff, telling you the whole history behind this and how it came to be. And there's The Return of the Living Dead, The Dead Have Risen, and Designing the Dead, some older carryover featurettes. And one cool thing, I've been seeing this on lists, bootleg lists, forever, and I just never got around to pulling the trigger on it. The Return of the Living Dead work print is included in here, and that was something I was like, ooh, that's something cool that I'd like to check out. The Buckaroo Banzai work print was another 80s classic that I watched many, many, many times. So this is another one of that period that I really wanted to check out and never had a chance to. So it was nice that it was included on here. It is in standard definition. It's very rough looking. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not they could have gotten a better version, or whether or not they just got a poor digital rip and transferred this over. But on the plus side, I didn't see any of those weird motion artifacts that can occasionally happen on Scream Factory's SD drops, like the Army of Darkness TV cut and the featurettes on the Mad Max disc. Everything seemed to move okay. So there was a lot of macro blocking and stuff like that, and digital artifacting. But that's one thing with VHS, bootlegs and work prints and stuff like that. The kind of artifacts that are just generated by copying and recopying VHS are something that the digital world doesn't know how to handle. So you really have to have no compression at all to make that work, and it has to look just like bad VHS essentially. But once you start mixing in digital compression on top of bad VHS, it opens up a whole can of weirdness. So still, it's an interesting curiosity piece. They could have just added the scenes that were longer separately, like they did with the Buckaroo Banzai DVD. I'm actually looking forward to Shout Factory's Buckaroo Banzai disc that's coming out next month. Hopefully I can get a copy and review it for you. But it was cool having the entire work print. I thought that was a really fun extra. And then, of course, the pièce de résistance, More Brains, A Return of the Living Dead, the definitive documentary. And that had been released before already on DVD, so it's not a new, 2-hour Scream Factory produced documentary. It's its own thing, but it is extremely extensive and intensive. And an amazing look at the creation of the film, the whole history behind it, and the interpersonal stuff going on in this film. Clu Gulager having some issues with Dan O'Bannon. Dan O'Bannon choosing some cast members because they were strippers and he thought they looked good, and how the rest of the cast bristled at that and didn't actually get along well with some of the personalities, and about how some people were just really excited to be in a film. One of the cast members was essentially homeless at the time, so people were really psyched to be part of this, and then some people were very negative about it. So yeah, there's a lot of drama going on, but it's not your typical documentary where like everybody just toes the line and goes, yes, working with so and so was a fantastic experience. Really fascinating when it gets into the crew of the film as well, and the fact that there was problems with the special effects, and how a special effects team member was cast off from the film because of less than stellar work. Yet some of the other stuff he did was really fantastic. So it makes no bones about kind of explaining the situation, and not in a pointing finger way either, which is really cool. It just states how it was and just puts everything out on the table. Really amazing documentary. Everybody seems like they're having a good time talking about it. Even the people that, bad things are being said about them from time to time. Apparently there's a version which has more information, or there's some extra bits on a DVD release about the sequels, but I don't know. I don't really get into the sequels. I know 2 and 3 are pretty well regarded in the horror community, but and I'm a huge fan of Ken Wiederhorn's Shockwaves, and Brian Usden's done some great stuff, but I just couldn't get into 2 and 3, and so I apologize for that. So I really don't care about seeing any of that stuff. So I was glad they just had them talking about this film. Yeah, amazing collector's edition. The film looks great. DTS mono track sounds great. And yeah, I don't really need a revisionist 7.1 surround sound track anyways. So definitely excited about this. It completely took me right back to 1985, and I had a blast. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for hanging in for the long haul. If you did, if you made it to the end, I'll say a word and then you can say it back to me, and I'll know you made it to the end. So pierogies. There you go. That's the code word. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll talk to you soon. Cheers, everybody.